About Ukraine. Stephen Cohen is with us, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War, out now in paperback. He recently wrote a piece for The Nation headlined, Cold War Again? Who's Responsible? Are we seeing the beginning of a new Cold War, Professor Cohen, and what exactly is happening right now in Ukraine?
Those are big questions. We are not at the beginning of the Cold War, a new one. We are well into it, which alerts us to the fact, just watching what you showed up there, that hot war is imaginable now. For the first time in my lifetime, my adult lifetime since the Cuban Missile Crisis, hot war with Russia. It's unlikely, but it's conceivable. And if it's conceivable, something has to be done about it. You did two things on your introduction which were very important. Almost alone among American media, you actually allowed Putin to speak for himself. He's being filtered through the interpretation of the mass media, here allegedly what he said, and it's not representative. The second thing is, let us look just what's happening at this moment, or at least yesterday. The political head of NATO just announced a major escalation of NATO forces in Europe. He did a Churchillian riff. We will increase our power in the air and the sea, on the land. Meanwhile, as negotiations today began in Geneva, we're demanding that Russians de-escalate. And yet we, NATO, are escalating as these negotiations begin. So if you were to say what is going on in Ukraine today, and unfortunately, the focus is entirely on eastern Ukraine. We don't have any Western media in eastern Ukraine. We don't have any Western media in Western Ukraine, the other half of the country. We're not clear what's going on there. But clearly, things are getting worse and worse. Each side has a story that totally conflicts with the other side's story. There seems to be no middle ground. And if there's no middle ground in the public discourse, in the Russian media or the American media, it's not clear what middle ground they can find in these negotiations. Though personally, I think, and people will say, oh, Cohen's a Putin apologist, but it seemed to me that the proposals the Russians made a month ago for resolving the conflict are at least a good starting point. But it's not clear the United States is going to accept them.
Well, Steve Cohen, it was just a few weeks ago when we had you on as the crisis was beginning to unfold in Ukraine, and a lot of what you said then turned out to be true, which was that you feared that there would be a split in Ukraine itself between the East and West, and obviously Crimea was just developing then. But it seems that all of the emphasis in the coverage here is as if the crisis started with Russian aggression, not with the earlier period of what was NATO and Europe's involvement in Ukraine before the deposing of the elected president.
Well, I think you've emphasized the absolute flaw in at least the American, because I don't follow European press very closely, the American media and political narrative. As a historian, I would say that this conflict began 300 years ago, but we can't do that. As a contemporary observer, it certainly began in November 2013, when the European Union issued an ultimatum, really, to the then president, elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, that sign an agreement with us, but you can't have one with Russia too. In my mind, that precipitated this crisis. Because why give a country that has been profoundly divided for centuries, and certainly in recent decades, an ultimatum, an elected president, choose and divide your country further? So when we say today, Putin initiated this chaos, this danger of war, this confrontation, the answer is no. That narrative is wrong from the beginning. It was triggered by the European Union's unwise ultimatum. Now flash forward to just 1 month ago, about the time I was with you before. Remember that the European foreign ministers, 3 of them, I think, went to Kiev and negotiated with Yanukovych, who was still the president, an agreement. Now, the Russians were present at the negotiation, but they didn't sign it. But they signed off on it. They said, okay. What did that agreement call for? Yanukovych would remain president until December. not May when elections are now scheduled, but December of this year. Then there would be a presidential election. He could run in them or not. Meanwhile, there would be a kind of government of national accord trying to pull the government together. And importantly, Russia would chip in trying to save the Ukrainian economy. But there would also be parliamentary elections. That made a lot of sense, and it lasted 6 hours. The next day, the street, which was now a mob, it was no longer peaceful protesters, as it had been in November. It had now become something else, controlled by very ultra-nationalist forces, overthrew Yanukovych, who fled to Russia, burned up the agreement. So who initiated the next stage of the crisis? It wasn't Russia. They wanted that agreement of February, a month ago, to hold, and they're still saying, why don't we go back to it? You can't go back to it. Though there is a report this morning that Yanukovych, who is in exile in Russia, may fly to eastern Ukraine today or tomorrow, which will be a whole new dimension. But the point of it is that Putin didn't want, and this is reality, this is not pro-Putin or pro-Washington, this is just a fact. Putin did not want this crisis, he didn't initiate it. But with Putin, once you get something like that, you get Mr. Pushback, and that's what you're now seeing. And the reality is, as even the Americans admit, he holds all the good options. We have none. That's not good policy making, is it?